Okay, media of art, painting. This is our second one. The first one is drawing, and drawing is really going to be the base for this one, painting, as well as the next, media of art, printmaking. Because with painting, basically what we're doing here in painting is we are essentially drawing with paint. Okay, and so this is an example of that. And so the first question we're going to ask ourselves here is, what is paint? What is paint made out of? And there's going to be three things basically that paint is made out of that we're going to call our three constituents of paint. Okay, our three constituents of paint are pigment, binder, and vehicle. Okay, the first thing we need for paint is something that's going to hold the properties of color. Okay, and that's what pigments are. They're basically, things that are ground up that have a particular hue, and so it's going to create this powder that holds those properties of color. Now if you took that and you threw it against a wall to paint a wall, not much of those pigments would stick, and so that's why you need a binder. Binder holds the pigments together and attaches it to the surface. And then the last thing here, the vehicle, it loosens up the paint enough to be able to move it around freely so the artist can fashion it at will. Okay, and so those three things are what makes up paint. And just like with drawing, we had our different materials, but we also had the paper itself. With paint, we also have our surface that we're painting on. And we can divide the surface up into two categories here in painting. The first thing is a support. That is the surface being painted. Okay, and that could be a lot of things. You can paint on a lot of different things, like a wall. You could paint on a canvas, on a panel, on a sheet of paper. Each of those would be the support because that is the surface being painted. Okay, now for instance, if you're painting maybe the inside maybe of your interior wall, something like that, and you're trying to paint from like a red to a yellow, for instance, what you would probably want to do is to prime it and then paint it yellow. Okay, it's going to come out usually better that way. And so that's what the ground is. It's the surface preparation of the support. And a popular primer used amongst painters is gesso. That would be an example of a popular primer. So for instance, if you go to, say, Michael's or something to get a canvas, canvas is just a fabric stretched across a board. You're not just going to get that. You're going to get a canvas that has been properly prepared with the right ground. It'll oftentimes note that it's been 2 or 3 times primed, and so that means that the canvas is ready really to receive the paint. Now you could paint without a ground, but it's not going to be able to receive the paint quite as well. Okay, so here's our three constituents of paint, and then our surface, which is divided into our two categories. Okay, the next part of paint here is the different types of paint. Okay, we have 6 different types we're going to go over. And just like with drawing, how a pencil is going to look different than, say, a pen, charcoal is going to look very different than a pen as well. These paints are going to be different too. And I want you to be able to visually tell the difference between these. Okay, so that's what we're going to practice. And so part of that is learning what each of the characteristics of each of these paints are. Okay, the first one is watercolor, and it's a thin, translucent type of paint. It's very fluid. It's got kind of this low reworkability factor in there as well. The second one is tempera, where it's more on the matte side. It's translucent. It's bright and airy in its color quality. And the next one is encaustic. It's got this deep resonant tone. Impasto, which is the term that we use for really thick, expressive brush strokes. And it's got more opacity than our first 2 types of paints. After that's fresco, which is an ancient wall painting technique. It's got a color tone similar to tempera, but it's involving plaster and different processes there. Then we have oil, which has rich, vibrant colors, very reworkable. You can definitely have impasto. You can also do glazing techniques, and it's very flexible too. And then acrylic is the newest of these paints, and it's got this intense, pure type of color tone to it. Very convenient, and it's very good because it bonds with a lot of different materials. Okay, so we're going to look at each of these here a little bit more in depth. So let's look at the first one here, watercolor. Watercolor is it's a little bit different as far as the painting technique because essentially you're kind of staining the paper is what you're doing. And you really apply it in thin translucent washes. And because of that translucence, the light's going to be able to pass through the different layers of color. And so you really build up your color, you know, kind of over itself in these washes. And so you build it up from light to dark. Most of the highlights you see are obtained by leaving the white of the paper untouched. It's a very fluid type of medium. The strength here is the spontaneity, and we have some interesting color combinations as well that happens. So for instance, maybe sometimes you might see an orange in a watercolor where it's just a wash of red over a wash of yellow. You know, something like that is what can happen, and you can have some really interesting effects as the color kind of bleeds into the next. The difficulty here is that it's difficult to make alterations because like I said, you're essentially staining the paper. It's not a traditional type of technique where you just kind of be able to paint over it. It doesn't quite work that way, and so you really kind of have to, you know, pursue it here in layers. Okay, and so another thing that we could mention here with watercolor is that because it's so translucent here, a lot of times artists will use something called a gouache, which is basically a type of watercolor, at least very similar to watercolor, that contains chalk within the pigments. So it's a little bit more opaque. Now it still has some translucence to gouache, but because of the chalk and the pigments there, it does have a little more opacity to it. Okay, so another example of watercolor is this image here. Okay, and you can really see you know, how it's similar to ink in that it's so fluid. And you have some really interesting effects, especially if you look kind of there in the foreground, and how these colors can kind of combine and mingle with each other. Some very different, interesting effects going on there in the foreground, as well as the background and middle ground too. You know, with the way that this image is built up here into layers. Okay, and so watercolor is going to have you know, a particular look to it. It'll probably be the easiest one to be able to visually tell the difference of here. Okay, these next three that we're going to look at are very traditional type of techniques that we really don't see that much anymore. But we'll see them some. Okay, this one is an example of a tempera painting. Okay, with tempera, it's a very traditional painting technique. You really see it dating back from the ancient Egyptians through the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans. Even artists throughout the Middle Ages used tempera. It's probably the most popular form of paint for you know, really a long time, until the invention of oil, essentially. There's some good attributes here with tempera. It's good for sharp lines, good for precise details. Yeah, it doesn't really darken with age, very luminous. Kind of gives you this light translucent color quality. And it also has a matte finish. M-A-T-T-E, matte, is the opposite of shiny. Okay, and so two things we'll hear a lot kind of describing paint. The first one is either translucent or opaque. If it's translucent, you can see through it. If it's opaque, you can't. And the other thing is really glossy versus matte. Those would be opposites as well. So tempera is more on the matte side. The difficulty with tempera is that sometimes the colors will change slightly during the drawing process. You know, it's nothing going to be crazy there, but you know, you wouldn't paint a blue and find it you know, orange or something like that. But you might have this experience if you paint the indoor of a house or something, that when it's wet it might be a slightly different value in terms of light and dark than when it's dry. You can have the same type of thing happen with tempera, and so that can be difficult sometimes. like watercolor, because it's so translucent, you kind of have to build it up with layers a lot of times. The reworkability is low as far as changing things. That's difficult to do, and so you would have to really work everything out with an underpainting beforehand. So that's how artists kind of learned, through this technique to build up paint with this underpainting, and then you would overpaint with these thin types of translucent layers for the best results. So here is an example of one of the artists that tended to work in tempera. His name is Botticelli, and this is called the Birth of Venus, one of the most famous paintings that we have. And he really kind of held on to tempera for a little bit longer than most artists, because by this time most artists were kind of making the transition to oil paint. The binder here actually with tempera is egg yolk. And so one of the things as well with tempera is, because if we think about what egg yolk would be like when it dries, it would be very stiff. And so the paint itself becomes very stiff. And so you need a very resistant, very rigid type of support to paint on. So most of the time if you see a tempera painting, it's going to be on some type of panel that's not going to give, because the paint itself isn't going to give, so you need that rigid support to it. And so that's kind of an inconvenience as well, especially if you're working on something really large scale like this painting here. Okay, so the next painting that we see is also a traditional type of paint. It's something called encaustic. And here our binder is a molten beeswax. Okay, so if you think of something like wax, like let's say like a chapstick, would be something that would have like a wax in it. The way you're going to get it to be liquid enough to paint is by applying heat. So if you've ever left your chapstick in the car, you might return to find it melted into your cap. Okay, and so that's the idea here with encaustic, is that you have some type of waxy type of binder that's going to hold the pigments, and your vehicle is actually heat. Now the difficulty is exactly that. It's that to paint with this, you have to keep it on some type of heating surface the whole time you're painting with it. Okay, and so that can be a difficulty, certainly. But the color quality, it's more of an opaque type of paint, because if you think about the character of a wax, for instance, you're going to have a real thick buildup to it. And so that's a huge advantage here with encaustic, as opposed to like a tempera or a watercolor, is that with encaustic you can really make these thick expressive marks. And the color quality has kind of more of a deep resonant tone to it. It's kind of has this kind of deep varied glow to this particular painting like we see here. This is one of the few examples actually that we have from the modern art world. This is Jasper Johns, and we lose a little bit in these reproductions, but if you were to see this painting in real life, you'd see that it really does have a lot of texture to the paint itself, that it really gets almost three-dimensional in kind of its texture if you see it up close. Okay, another example of this encaustic painting that you can see is this example here, and you can see kind of the shine that you see off the surface there from from that waxy buildup from the tempera. The encaustic process here. Yeah, you can see how that buildup is happening there. Okay, so this is our next type of paint. This is a fresco, and this is probably our most famous fresco here, the Creation of Adam by Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And you can see in color quality it is quite similar to a tempera. It's got kind of like a light type of airy type of quality, almost like a pastel to it, maybe would be another way to think of it. With with this particular process, we're actually using a plaster, and it has kind of a lime base to this particular plaster that's used that has kind of a chemical reaction. So one of the odd things about fresco is that it really doesn't reach its full color intensity until it's after actually painted, several years actually after it's painted, until it, like I said, really reaches that maximum color intensity. But the technique here, you'd have to mix the pigments with plaster, and so the plaster really attaches to the wall, and the painting kind of becomes the plaster, and the plaster becomes the wall, and so they kind of become this one kind of entity here. To move a fresco would be very difficult, and so that's one reason why we see it used for large murals, is because it's pretty permanent and it does last well over time. Okay, so here's an example that maybe we'd be familiar with. Here's another example of a fresco. This is Diego Rivera, I believe, did this fresco. And it's the same technique that Michelangelo was using for the most part of getting plaster and mixing our pigment in with that, and having our murals done in this fashion here. Okay, so some of the difficulties here with fresco is that because you're mixing plaster and that's going to dry, throughout a given period of time, is you have to understand and have a reasonable expectation on what you're going to get to throughout that day. So, for instance, you mix too much plaster and you find that you're done working for the day and you have all this plaster that you haven't painted into. Well, the next day you're going to have to either chip or sand that plaster down to get fresh plaster to actually get the painting on the wall. Or you could have the other problem and mix too little plaster and kind of be twiddling your thumbs until you could get some new plaster mixed, ready to go. Okay, and so this process is also is not very reworkable. Because of that difficulty with knowing how long the plaster is going to be available and how much you can get to throughout the course of the day. So it's not really great for reworking things. You really have to have things mapped out beforehand. Alright, so let's look at our next one here. Okay, this is actually one of the first oil paintings we see in Northern Europe. I think it was actually developed in Asia, if I'm not mistaken, then brought to the northern Flanders area where the Northern Renaissance was happening in the early 1400s, and then is brought down after that into the Italian Renaissance. And by the 1450s, up to a little bit later into the late 1400s, that's when it's eventually embraced by some of the famous artists we would know, like Da Vinci and Raphael. And so if we look at oil paint, there's several things that are good about oil paint that really makes it to where tempera and encaustic aren't used as much. Okay, the first thing is oil is very flexible. Now, if we look back at tempera, if we remember, that's going to be a very stiff type of paint, so it's not going to have the type of flexibility you would want to paint on something like canvas. But with oil, you can paint on canvas, and so it's going to be a lot more convenient, especially at the time, to paint on canvases as opposed to a heavy type of panel. Okay, so we have that working for it. Also, you can see just how much detail is available with this example here. There's detail everywhere. There's detail in the background. There's detail in the foreground. You can actually read some of the that book there. I wouldn't be able to read it per se, but you can see that there's lines in the book with those types of details, even in the crowns and in the dress of the individuals. There's a lot of details here to go around. Another thing is the three-dimensional quality that you get with oil, because it dries very slowly. It gives you a chance to really render these details pretty exact. Okay, and so that's one thing about it. Another thing about it is because of the character of oil, you can thin it down through this process called glazing, and you can work kind of in similar ways that you would work in tempera, where you would be able to have like an underpainting, and through the various different layers you could build up color that way. Okay, so you can work with color that would be very translucent. But you could also build up the paint and work really thickly using an impasto technique. Okay, that would be, again, the term that we would use for really thick expressive brushstrokes. And so it really kind of has the best of both worlds in that capacity. You can have those thick brushstrokes like in caustic. You can have these really fine details and smooth transitions that you would have with something like tempera. Okay, this is an example of a painting up close here, a self-portrait here by Rembrandt. So if we look really closely, we can see how thick a lot of these passages are. And so, for instance, if we pay attention to his face there, you'll see that a lot of the lightest areas in terms of value are the thickest areas. Okay, and that's going to give us kind of a telltale sign of what oil looks like, is that with oil, because of the characteristic of the translucence of it, you really have to have the light values really thick piled on top of the dark values and the midtones. And that's what we see here, where the lightest areas are. Those are the thickest areas here. Okay, so again here with oil, a lot of things to like. Another thing that we didn't mention just yet is that it's very reworkable. That with oil, because it stays wet so long, you can just kind of rub something out and just repaint directly into the wet paint. You can also wait for it to dry, and again, using a glazing technique, get back into the painting and paint wet into dry or wet into wet. It gives you a lot of capabilities as an artist to be able to rework things or change things or manipulate things. You can always kind of get back into the painting here with oil. So that's why artists prefer it, because of all of the capabilities artistically that they have with it. Now, the downside here with oil, excuse me, the downside here with oil is that with oil you have to have some type of toxic type of chemical to work with in order to clean it up. And so that's going to be, kind of a negative, especially if you're painting all the time, to be breathing in some type of paint thinner, with some type of toxic fumes isn't always the best thing in the world. Okay, so our last type of paint is the most recent kind of technical innovation within paint. It's something that was started really at the towards the end of the 20th century, so it's a pretty new phenomenon, and it's something called acrylic. And with acrylic, your binder is actually an acrylic polymer, and so it's going to give us a synthetic resin which produces some type of fast drying flexible film, and so that's where we get the term acrylic from, the acrylic polymer binder there. The colors are very similar to oil. You have a very vibrant, intense, pure type of hue, just like with oil that we see here in acrylic. There's certain advantages to acrylic that you have that you don't have with oil. For instance, one of the advantages is just the convenience. You don't have to have some type of paint thinner. All you need is a little bit of water, a little bit of soap maybe to clean it up, and it cleans up fine. The other major advantage with acrylic is that it binds very, very well to different types of surfaces. Okay, and so certain things like plastic maybe or metal, acrylic's going to be able to bind to that other paints, will not be able to bind to quite so well. Okay, so there's a lot to like about acrylic. You can even take acrylic, thin it down, and put it in an airbrush, and it'll work out fine. One of the negatives with acrylic, I guess we could call it a negative here, it's maybe not a negative as much as it's just kind of a characteristic here, and that is the paint itself. It doesn't have much translucence. Everything stays on the surface with acrylic. That as far as the color mixing, it mixes very well, but light's not able to pass through the top layers of an acrylic like light would be able to pass through the top layers of an oil. And so it's going to have, I guess the best way I can describe it is a very flat, kind of plastic type of look to acrylic. Okay, and so this is kind of intentionally flat with this particular painting here, but this would be another example here. That the painting itself, and sometimes it's easier actually to see from the side of paintings. The painting itself will have like a flat plastic look to it because of the binder is essentially a type of plastic there, acrylic polymer. So yeah, so it's going to have a little bit different look than oil. I think oil and acrylic are probably the two hardest to tell apart, so I'll try to get some easier examples to look at maybe than some more difficult ones. But they're two of the paints that we see probably most often today because of the capabilities they have. Okay, so this is it for painting, and the next media we'll look at is printmaking.